Hi, and welcome to Economist Impact's fourth Sustainability Week here in the US. I'm Apurva Kothari, Senior Analyst at Economist Impact, New York, and your moderator for today's panel discussion on Scope 3 practical ways to tackle the elephant in the room. Emissions from a company's value chain beyond its direct operations and purchased energy use, or in other words, Scope 3 emissions, are significant. On average, they constitute about 70% of a firm's total carbon footprint. And thus, although they offer the greatest decarbonization potential, Scope 3 emissions remain the most complex to tackle. To explore why that is and what are some practical ways to make progress towards addressing Scope 3 emissions, we have a great panel lined up for you today. We have Simon Fischweicher, who is Director Supply Chain and Reporter Services at CDP. CDP is a global nonprofit providing an environmental impact disclosure system for companies and governments. Joining us from Forum for the Future is Chief Executive Dr. Sally Uren. Forum for the Future is a global sustainability nonprofit organization focused in the areas of food, energy, and the purpose of business. And Jason Noel from Zycus, who leads the ESG data management platform Lythouse in North America. Thank you all for joining us today. I want to start us off by discussing taking stock of Scope 3 emissions. One cannot address emissions that they don't measure, and that appears to be a critical pain point in tackling Scope 3 emissions across industries. Last year, about only 20% of the companies analyzed across energy, financial services, retail, and manufacturing sectors were measuring and tracking all relevant sources of their Scope 3 emissions per Economist Impact's Decarbonization Progress Benchmark. So, what are some pertinent challenges preventing firms from taking a comprehensive stock of their Scope 3 emissions? Simon, perhaps I'll start with you here.
Great. Well, really appreciate the opportunity to talk about Scope 3 with this audience. It's something that at CDP we spend 24/7 considering and thinking about, because our role is creating and collecting that standardized, structured, comparable set of data on environmental issues from climate change, biodiversity, deforestation, water security, and plastics for the investor and customer community. And a big portion of our work is engaging companies on the importance of value chain impacts. And when we talk about climate change, that's Scope 3. We tend to find three primary challenges companies face when considering reporting and calculating their Scope 3 emissions: availability of data, the reliability of data, and then a reticence to actually report that information. On the availability front, because Scope 3 emissions are the emissions in either your supply chain or downstream use of sold product, making sure that you have accurate primary data from suppliers, for instance, for supply chain emissions can be a real challenge. And that's where CDP is working with about 330 companies globally, ranging from BT Group to Walmart to Vodafone, who are actively collecting primary emissions data from their suppliers on Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, and then actually using allocation based on spend to pull that data and help them calculate their Scope 3 emissions. There's only about 24,000 companies disclosing through CDP right now. It's a number we're really excited about, and it's grown 24% year on year. But there's hundreds of thousands of millions of businesses out there who are not reporting on emissions that in the absence of their emissions reporting means that their upstream customers or investors are missing out on data to support more accurate Scope 3 emissions. So Scope 3 emissions tends to be a group challenge because we all need each other's data. Reliability of data is another issue where, as small to medium-sized enterprises or companies who are just beginning in the exercise of GHG calculations are learning the process, sometimes the data that the businesses that we work with who are collecting data from their suppliers use may be unreliable. It may not be verified through a third party. It may look suspiciously large or small compared to industry peers. And so what we do in that case is, one, through our scoring and disclosure framework, we really incentivize companies to utilize third-party verification. And we've seen that trend growing where about 2/3 of companies we're working with now are using some form of third-party verification, which gives a greater sense of reliability to that data. And we also work with companies like Alphabet to look at industry averages and trends and outline potential outliers from their supplier emission reporting, and then work with them to go back to those suppliers to recalculate and report those emissions. Finally, the third piece is reticence to report that information. And for many businesses, the fact that these numbers are so large, but also outside the control of their direct operations, is a bit unnerving when thinking about public reporting of data. And so what we've done through our work in standardizing and structuring the data that companies report is help companies understand that peers are reporting this information, investors and customers are looking for this information, and also through reports that we've produced that demonstrate for certain sectors like food and beverage, category 1 purchase goods and services, sort of upstream supply chain emissions, represent at least 70% of an overall footprint, that a savvy customer or investor who is using this data is going to notice if you're not reporting it, right? And so that's a key piece, that even if you're estimating that information, the stakeholders who are looking for this type of reporting from you are aware of the relative impacts of Scope 3 on your business. If you're an oil and gas or transport OEM company and you're not disclosing use of sold product downstream category 11 Scope 3 emissions, you can tell I'm a Scope 3 nerd here, someone's going to ask questions about that, right? And someone's going to be estimating that number for you. So I'll leave it there. Again, it's availability, reliability, and the reticence to actually report information are the three factors that we see on that topic.
Thank you, Simon, for framing some of those key critical pain points. Jason, I wanted to delve a little bit into the point made by Simon about reliability. And I know, as someone who's working with enterprises on managing their ESG data platform, accuracy and precision is key. So what is your perspective on this question?
Yeah, so thank you, Simon, for laying the framework here, and again, very honored to be here as part of this panel and representing Lighthouse, the data management platform. So the data challenge is real, right? Data comes from disparate systems. When you're looking at Scope 3, you really want to extract procurement data, right? Traditionally, and we say traditionally, maybe even 6 months ago, because this landscape is evolving every month, you would focus on spend, right? But we found out that very quickly that spend is not the most accurate way to do it. You can extract spend, but for example, if I'm flying to this Economist conference in New York on an economy class ticket, which I do, my ticket might cost $200. But if our executives are coming in, they might be first class, and the same flight from DC to New York would be $2,000, for example. Now, would that flight have any difference in the emissions? It doesn't. So if you're using spend alone, you're getting a 10x for the first class ticket. So that's just an example why you need to use procurement data and look at the invoice line items, but you also need to consider activity-based calculations. So I think in terms of the accuracy of data and reliability, data is a huge challenge regardless of ESG reporting for organizations. It is the lifeblood of organizations for finance. It's no different for ESG. So when you're extracting the data from the relevant systems, whether it's procurement or HR or ERP systems, you want to make sure that the data is accurate. So a tool or a technology such as Lighthouse can help you cleanse that data by writing the extract scripts in a way. If you have a vendor of IBM, it could be I.B.M, International Business Machines, or just IBM, for example. That's all a single vendor and a single product. So using technology such as AI in cleansing that data and writing the rules when it's extracted at a frequency that you need for your reporting needs will definitely help cleanse that up. So reliability of data, being able to find it in the right systems and extract it in the right format is a big challenge that we're coming across, and we're supporting our enterprises to do this more accurately. And then, of course, the more accurate your data is, the better outcomes you're going to have. So we see that talking across industries, they all have unique set of suppliers, for example, right? There's the main big suppliers that most use, but then, for example, if you're a food production, company, how do you get a group of small farmers to report on their ESG data so that you can include that in your scope 3? So there has to be a combination of procurement, spend, activity-based, combining it with industry averages to get the most accurate sort of reporting. And I think, depending on who you talk to or which side of the aisle you're on, or if your organization is traditional, a laggard with ESG, or you're on the forefront, there are different flavors of how accurate you want. I mean, you could talk to some analysts and say that the ESG reporting should be as accurate as financial reporting. And then you have others that let's get to good enough. And because there's no real regulatory pressure quite yet, nobody really knows what to do and what's good enough. So that's what we're here to help you with in terms of a partner.
Thank you so much, Jason. And this discussion framing was great because it helped us highlight some of the key challenges on the road to stock taking. I now want to switch gears and talk about how can we navigate these and not only have firms take better stock of their scope 3 emissions, but then also start addressing them. And I think I would like to start maybe with Dr. Uren. What are some low-hanging fruits, especially when firms are trying to first come up with a strategy to address their scope 3 emissions? And by low-hanging fruits, I mean those lower effort pathways which can promise a significant potential for emission reduction. And maybe you can provide us with an industry or a firm example of enterprises you're collaborating with at Forum for Future.
Sure, thank you. Great to be here. Thanks for the question. When I was preparing for this discussion, I was reflecting on what is the biggest pain point that we're hearing from the partners that we work with at Forum. So Forum for the Future, we're a sustainability nonprofit. We work in partnership with a whole range of organisations. Many of them are large multinationals from across the food system, the energy system, consumer goods, and even finance. And it's true to say that scope 3 carbon emission reduction is probably the biggest challenge that they have right now. And within that, what then is the biggest challenge? And actually one of the bigger challenges that we hear from our partners is actually access to finance to accelerate scope 3 carbon emission reduction. So there are the low-hanging fruit, which is switching energy supply, innovation through supply chains. But actually right now, my observation is that possibly the biggest unlock that we need to focus on is access to finance to get rapid and urgent decarbonisation within supply chains. Because obviously that's where the scope 3 emissions are really being felt. And so I just wanted to share some of the techniques that we're seeing our partners use to try and think creatively about how to get finance in place to accelerate scope 3 emission reductions. The first is ring-fenced funds. So I'm seeing this particularly in the food system, and actually particularly in food retailers, whereby they want to switch supply to lower carbon intensive dairy or other lower carbon intensive materials. And actually that, in the case of dairy, might attract a price premium. And so what you're seeing actually is hypothecated funds being set aside to enable the procurement teams to source differently, but actually the procurement teams aren't taking the financial hit, if you will, because that ring fence fund is acting as a sort of balancing figure. That's one strategy I'm seeing used quite a lot. The second actually is really speaking to the spirit of the success I think we're going to need to see more of in Scope 3 emissions, which is actually partnerships and strategic investments. So particularly in consumer goods, I'm seeing consumer goods brands strategically investing in suppliers, which will enable them to rapidly decarbonize. But what the consumer goods brand is doing is agreeing to an offtake amount. So they're encouraging strategic investments, but they're saying, actually, we will then buy X amount of the product. And so you've got that sort of security of supply there. And this is where, in terms of that strategic investment with suppliers, we're also seeing some really clever financing. So HSBC is working in partnership with a whole range of organizations to create the finance packages that allow suppliers to decarbonize, but that risk is and the risk and cost is shared with the procurer. The third thing I'm seeing with mixed success, but is definitely worth thinking about, is shadow carbon pricing. So basically an internal mechanism whereby if you're thinking about new developments, you need to look at the carbon emissions that might be associated with that development. And actually that price then goes into an internal fund that allows innovation in the rest of the business. On a similar level as carbon pricing, I'm also seeing organizations actually utilize carbon credits from renewable energy generation and put those back into the business to encourage then supply chain innovation. The fourth thing that I can see happening is actually taking a more holistic business case. And I know at least one consumer goods organization that is this, which is asking the procurement team to think about EPR fees avoided. So because of a product innovation that's reduced carbon intensity, you might then need to pay less in terms of EPR. What's that price avoided? That's another mechanism. And then linked to carbon financing, but slightly different, I'm seeing some sustainability bonds emerging whereby the bond financing, so the interest rate, is linked to Scope 3 emissions reduction. The challenge there is the baselining figure, but I'm still seeing that working. And the final point I wanted to make is more of a structural point, and where I've seen organizations really get ahead of reporting and delivering on Scope 3 carbon emissions reductions team is where the sustainability team has kind of bifurcated, and the team that is associated with ESG reporting is actually sitting in the finance function. So I see this kind of movement of sustainability professionals into the finance function as a real unlock in accelerating access to finance that in turn then accelerates that decarbonisation and the Scope 3 emission reductions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Uren. This has been super insightful, both the approaches for de-risking decarbonization to finance for food suppliers in your examples, and then how can corporate governance change in-house to combine sort of the sustainability function and finance function to really drive action in this area. And I think, Simon, I have the same question for you to discuss some practical approaches. If you have any industry examples in terms of the lowest hanging fruits approaches applied by a certain enterprise or industry, and then also a bit of insight into what is easy to implement today, but might become more complex or costly to adopt with time as a Scope 3 reduction approach.
First, really wanted to piggyback on a few things Sally mentioned, really salient points there. In particular, on the financing side, I'm glad that's how you mentioned the HSBC example. We're working with Walmart and Vodafone through some of those supplier financing projects where companies who are suppliers, for instance, to Walmart, who are disclosing Scope 1, 2 emissions or setting a target or have a validated science-based target that aligns that target with a 1.5 degrees Celsius trajectory and sort of facilitates not just the collection of Scope 1 and 2 data for Walmart, but actually the reduction, and helps Walmart hit the Project Gigaton goal they've set for their supply chain, will have access to better financing terms, right? Quicker payments from Walmart through HSBC, and potentially access to capital and at more favorable rates, right? So those are really practical examples. They're maybe not the low-hanging fruit, because that does take a bit of sort of working through supply chain financing and bringing your banking partners in. but it's a great example of cross-industry collaboration where you have a business customer looking to get more accurate Scope 3 emissions and ultimately reduce those emissions to hit their own goals. You have financial institutions who have their own aspirations and ambitions to position themselves favorably from an ESG perspective and hit climate targets. And you have suppliers who are looking to get paid, right? And can do can achieve that through action they take when it comes to climate change. So that's a fantastic example I wanted to double click on. When it comes to low-hanging fruit, CDP is a nonprofit that sort of established this space for climate disclosure. We see a journey, and for both businesses engaging their stakeholders to collect data, incentivize disclosure and action, as well as the suppliers or other stakeholders who are providing that data, discussing and working through that journey together is critical, right? And so it starts by, how do you collect the data? How do you go out and gather that information, whether it's starting through some of those estimations and industry averages that Jason referred to as that starting point when you're thinking about sort of where you want to be on that accuracy spectrum, or actually going out and getting primary data from your suppliers. And when you first start doing that, the 80-20 rule, really critical, right? Who are those highest impact suppliers? Where's the most spend? And let's focus, rather than boiling the entire ocean, let's focus on really narrowing in on those suppliers first, get data from them, work with them to understand, why are you doing this? Why is it important to you? And then build off of that approach. And a key tool that we found is putting out the ask and sort of hoping a stakeholder like a supplier is going to provide the data isn't enough. You need to be a partner in that effort. And I think that's something that we've talked a bit about. And part of that we've seen with companies like Stanley Black & Decker, who have worked with us to actually hold workshops for their suppliers in China on how to calculate greenhouse gas emissions, how to set a science-based target, and work with those suppliers to understand why that's important to Stanley Black & Decker, right? And so that conversation, that engagement across your supply chain is critical. What we've also found, whether this is low-hanging fruit or not, is I think that depends on your relationship with your industry peers, but industry collaboration is really critical. We've brought together a number of companies in the IT sector, including Alphabet, Cisco, Dell, and others, who may be competitors in certain lanes, but when it comes to climate change, have many shared suppliers and want to make sure that when that supplier discloses, it's right once, read many, right? We don't want to have a whole convoluted set of expectations across an industry, but can we come together as an industry and say, we want Scope 1 and 2 emissions data, and we want suppliers to be increasing renewable energy procurement by 10% per year, right? And this is an expectation we're going to set out for our suppliers. So it's not just one voice, and it's not many voices saying many different things. So I think, starting with the data collection in a focused manner, finding ways to incentivize that data collection through mechanisms like supplier financing, really critical, and then engaging both across your supply chain, but also across your industry, can be really critical. And all of those things are doable now as they start to really get going, and you see industry peers moving forward. What's going to be more expensive later is playing catch up, right? When folks have already built the systems and the engagement programs with their suppliers, and built the internal approval mechanisms, by the time you step into the ring, if it's a couple years from now, it's going to be a lot more expensive to play catch up, and you might have to do so quickly. I think we'll get to this in the next question, but if regulation sort of continues to emerge. So I'll leave it there. I know we have a few other discussion points, but really excited about the opportunities for mitigation of Scope 3.
Thank you, Simon. And I think it was great, both Sally and Simon, for you to highlight these various practical approaches and sort of those different levers, there's of course a role that financial institutions have to play. There's great opportunity for cross-industry collaboration on Scope 3 emissions. And Jason, I want to get back to you to try to understand, given this basis, how can sort of better data management navigate not only some of those challenges that we discussed in section 1 when it comes to measuring, but also addressing Scope 3 emissions at large? If you could provide any examples of enterprises that you're collaborating with on this, that would be super helpful.
Sure. Yeah, and, insightful conversation there to help frame this. But so we're talking to both small, medium, and large enterprises, right? And they each have their unique challenges. And, budget limitations is huge, right? Sustainability teams in some of these organizations are newly created, haven't been around for a while. They don't know how to procure what they need, right? So they're living in these spreadsheets that could be massive when you are turning your focus away from scope 1 and 2 into scope 3. It's an exponential increase in the manual effort that is put on these teams' shoulders, right? So if you have a sustainability team of 3 folks, for example, and that's your FTE budget, but they're spending 6 months sifting through spreadsheets to do the manual reporting and calculations. It's just not an efficient use of their time. And we've seen this real time in some industries, those around in the $750 million revenue range. Obviously, the larger players, we've talked to several, $10 billion plus organizations. They do have a team, but you'd be surprised of their sort of hesitance to use AI. They in these systems, they kind of feel like it's the Terminator movie and Skynet. AI is going to take over the world. But what we're talking about here in AI to help with ESG reporting is really just automating the application of the 60,000 plus emission factors when you're extracting the data, helping you to automate report generations across whichever frameworks that you want. We have, for example, the frameworks built in GRI, et cetera, into the tool. So it's a huge manual effort if you want to put out a report, potentially for CSRD or California or GRI frameworks. This tool could be a central repository for all your data. So you enter it once, and then you can switch between the frameworks within your reporting. So these teams don't know how to find budget, and surprisingly, it's not too expensive, to set up a technology program with this. So I think a low-hanging fruit would be to automate that. So we are, they're slugging a cart with square wheels up a hill, right? Thinking of trying to build the pyramids, right? Well, we're offering a cart with wheels, and that's basically what technology can help. So there really shouldn't be a hesitance there. And I think that the industry, it's been analyzed that potentially 90% of leaders out of a survey of about 650 expect to be using automated tools for ESG reporting within the next 3 years. So we're heading in the right direction. Once they can get past some of those barriers of investments, find out where the budget exists, whether it's coming from procurement or finance, then their teams could focus on higher level activities, the mitigation, which we feel is very important. We're very passionate about enabling these companies to quickly, efficiently extract the data, analyze it, use AI to see insights that the human eye can't catch with spreadsheets that might be a mile wide and hundreds of thousands of invoice line items, right? So that they can then focus on mitigation. Our founder, personally, where I'm from, and I'm sure other tools are, is very passionate about sustainability, out to change the world, right? Give these companies the tools they need so that if they're voluntarily reporting or doing it for a lower cost of capital or brand image or even a competitive advantage over their competitors, we want to give them the tools and then change the world so they can focus on the mitigation. So, getting out of manual efforts, spreadsheets, weighing down your teams with the reporting activities that could be automated. We're not replacing the sustainability teams. We're just repurposing their efforts so that it could focus more on the mitigation, rather than calculating the emissions, et cetera. So I think that's a low-hanging fruit from a technology standpoint.
Thank you so much, Jason, Simon, and Sally, for highlighting some of these key levers in addressing Scope 3 emissions. We talked about the role of corporate governance and how sustainability and finance functions coming together can build internal company momentum. Here, we talked about the role of technology and automation, and that being a low-hanging fruit in collecting that reliable and accurate data for emissions in the first place. The scope for really win-win-win partnerships between various industry peers and suppliers, and sort of then supporting suppliers in finding that access to finance to actually de-risk some of their decarbonization practices so that you can achieve those purchased goods and services emissions reductions, which are so critical for sectors like food. So thank you so much for your observations. I would want to conclude today's session by delving into the business case for investing in managing Scope 3 emissions. Now, we know that regulatory pressure to disclose Scope 3 emissions has only started to build up with sort of the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive coming into the Europe and Climate Corporate Data Accountability Act in California. But more globally, legal frameworks are yet to require firms to actually address these emissions. Despite this limited policy push, why might businesses tackle these emissions today? If you could provide any tangible examples of costs or risks that are avoided by doing so, or the potential return on investment, that would be super helpful. And maybe, Simon, you could get us started in here.
Sure. First, I think while the emerging regulations are just getting started, I would revert to a point I made previously, which is the trend is only going towards more attention from regulation on climate, Scope 1, 2, and potentially Scope 3 emissions as well. And there are thousands of organizations who are already reporting Scope 3 emissions who will be prepared as those regulations continue to emerge. If you're not one of them, Scope 3 emissions, as we've talked about, is not an easy task, and playing catch up later is a costly exercise, right? So I think there's a huge risk mitigation in building the internal mechanisms to at least begin estimating Scope 3 emissions, right? Finding that starting point in that journey. But it's not all sticks, right? There's a number of carrots here to be unearthed. There's a number of positive benefits towards calculating Scope 3 emissions. For one, when we think about competitive differentiation and creating value in a world where the markets are demanding more low carbon business models, more low carbon products and services, Scope 3 emissions allow you to identify those hot spots in your value chain, whether it's in the supply chain of your purchased goods and services, whether it's in the processing of your sold goods or the use of your sold goods or waste related to your goods or transportation upstream or downstream in your business model. And when you look at those figures and begin to collect that data, you can identify, okay, where are the most impactful interventions from a climate perspective going to be? So when I do make those investments in emission reduction initiatives or engaging suppliers or thinking about the products and services I sell, you're doing so in a data-driven manner. So I think many businesses who are approaching Scope 3 now are doing so as a pre-compliance measure, perhaps, or because someone is asking them to do so. But I would also encourage you to think of that as a management tool, right? As you assess where the best investments you can make in low carbon initiatives are. And it's also the biggest space for innovation, right? Value chain innovation. What are the new inputs or ingredients that are going to create efficiency for your products, right? And potentially reduce costs in your supply chain. So there's a lot to be unearthed there. And there's also a lot of reward, right? There are financial institutions who are building funds based on companies who set science-based targets or achieve certain ESG goals. And if you want access to that capital, Scope 3 emissions are part and parcel to a science-based or net zero goal, right? And so making sure that you're positioning yourself to access capital is critical there. And there are some leading business customers who have made the decision that Scope 3 is a big management tool for them. They want access to capital, and they want their suppliers to provide this data, and not just Scope 1 and 2, because they appreciate that their supplier Scope 3 emissions may sort of carry through to the impact on their products and services they're selling. And so they're going to demand those targets. They're going to demand those Scope 3 emissions. And you may find if you're not producing that type of data, you may have a harder time getting customers. And if you are producing that type of data and you've got a good story to tell about it and some strong targets, you might have access to new customers. So, definitely pre-compliance is part of it. Management tool, I would really hone in on that. And then access to investors and customers are things that we're seeing at CDP.
Thank you so much, Simon. And Jason, I might pass the same question to you. Why might it be important to invest in sort of like data tools that can help better track Scope 3 emissions?
Sure. Yeah. And, having connected with, hundreds of different enterprises across industries, it goes back to the uniqueness of the industry and actually the corporate processes and practices, right? And then the reasons for reporting, right? So it's just the automation of that manual effort that is big. And, going after that lower cost of capital could be a difference maker when it comes to financial reporting and results to the street. The brand image, competitive advantage. It has been proven, I believe, in some analyst reports that good sustainability practices have actually shown to increase revenues. So these are all reasons that the CEOs, CFOs should take notice of what the sustainability teams are doing. And a good tool, for example, will have your traditional carbon accounting and use the latest cutting edge AI to help make that most accurate by taking procurement data, triangulating it with the supplier data at the item level. But it'll also have, a goal navigator, so you can enter in whatever the various goals of the organization are across silos. So procurement, finance, sustainability may have goals, whether it's not just environmental related, but social and governance or diversity initiatives and hiring practices, et cetera, could be entered in the tool and then allow visibility to the progress over time, right? So sort of a goal tracker, then that really helps build your team's credibility as well as the C-level will start seeing, this team is adding to the competitive advantage. And something truly unique that, Lythouse is bringing to the table here is a supplier community. We have a background in source to pay technology. So we have a network of millions of suppliers that we are preceding their ESG data. So that would help eliminate the fatigue that these teams have, or procurement or supply chain, colleagues have in chasing down ESG data from the supply chain. So having sort of the main suppliers pre-housed and available to you will help eliminate that potential fatigue. And when choosing a software, a Nissan or a Ford will get you in the same place, right? So really, it's a crowded marketplace, but really you're not buying just the software tool, you're investing in the right product and strategy and vision, right? So, and then the ability for that company to execute on the vision. And then the support model is huge. You want to look for, the bright people that are passionate about it to help you get that ROI and business value. So your teams will start to be seen as, adding towards the competitive advantage. But most importantly, there's a lot of gray areas across industries. For example, the small farmer not being able to report their data to you, but they're a primary vendor for you. So being able to partner with the technology vendor on the roadmap and figuring out how to navigate through that, all the gray areas and the evolving regulations, I think is key as well. So regardless of why you're reporting voluntary regulatory pressures, if you've got 160 million euros of revenue in Europe, or you have a presence in California, those are coming down the line. Or if you're just doing it for the competitive advantage, a data tool, management tool, purpose built for ESG reporting will go a long way.
Thank you so much, Jason. And I would lastly turn to Dr. Uren. Why is it important for companies to start investing in measuring and tackling their Scope 3 emissions?
Well, the main reason is that actually we're running out of time to get to net zero, but that's not enough. We need a business case. And what I see are three real business benefits from working with your supply chain and investing in your supply chain to decarbonize. The first is supply chain resilience. Your supply chain is as strong as the weakest link in it. And if you can help all of your supply chain become more resilient by investing in decarbonisation, that gives you supply chain resilience. Lots of examples of that happening, particularly in food and agriculture, actually. The second business benefit is actually Scope 3 decarbonisation through your supply chain can deliver operational efficiency. So there are brands such as Vitel that have invested in regenerative agriculture for their farmers. That's actually reduced input costs and improved efficiency. So there's a strong business case there. And to echo Simon's point, I've seen investment in Scope 3 carbon emission reduction and focusing on Scope 3 emissions lead to all sorts of innovation. And one of my favourite examples is Interface Carpets, who actually use discarded fishing nets to put into a carpet to reduce the carbon intensity of the carpet. But that innovation gave them a new product. It also gave the fishermen a new source of income. So all sorts of business benefits for doing this, along with the imperative to act. And I would echo what Simon had said, the sooner we figure out how to do this, the better, because regulation is coming. Regulation is a lagging indicator. There's room for the trailblazers to get ahead and actually turn this into strong business benefit.
Thank you so much, Sally. And thank you so much, Simon and Jason, for joining this super insightful discussion today. You leave the audience with some great points in the business case. Not only is it that regulation is only going to build up, regulators are not going to stop at just asking for disclosure. They're going to ask for addressing these emissions tomorrow. So of course that, but then also highlighting the carrots, which is the competitive differentiation that comes with it, supply chain visibility that an organization can gain, and finally access to new sources of capital. So thank you again for such an insightful conversation, and I hope all of you have a lovely day ahead.